Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michelle Rosado, and I work at the Connecticut State Department of Education in the Performance Office. Thank you for taking the time today to participate in the CSDE's Professional Support for Districts webinar series. We want you to know that the staff at the Connecticut State Department of Education is here to support you in every way possible. We hope that you and your families continue to be well during this time. Today's webinar focuses on district financial considerations, and we're really lucky to have Kathy Demsey, our Chief Financial Officer, to take you through this. But before we get started, I just want to go through some reminders for you on the webinar. So all attendees are placed in mute for the duration of the webinar. To ask questions, please use the Q&A box as part of the options on the GoToWebinar. So please put your questions forward that way. Questions will be addressed by Kathy at the conclusion of the session. And just as a reminder, the session is being recorded and it will be posted to the CSDE's website. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Kathy.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for joining me this morning. As Michelle said, I hope all of you and your families are well. This certainly is a really crazy time. I don't have a lot of slides to go through, and they're pretty high level around state grant funds. The latest information I have on the Federal CARES Act, and then a brief response to some questions we've been getting about one of the executive orders and how it relates to local school districts doing their budgeting. Because the reason I actually didn't do a ton of slides was that I'd like to take this opportunity for you to be able to ask me questions so that you and your colleagues can hear the answers, so that I can hear what you're thinking. And then be able to, hopefully, if I can't answer those questions today, get with my colleagues at the department and the Office of Policy and Management in the Governor's Office in order to get you guidance, because I certainly can understand just how difficult a time this is for all of you. In terms of state grant funds, so you should know that the balance of all of your state grant funds are going to be continued to be paid through the close of the fiscal year. This includes ECS, which will go out next week. And if you're drawing down on Alliance district funding, priority school district funding, all of our choice grants will still continue to be paid. To the extent that you run after school programming where you've continued to engage the employees and you're doing some kind of distance learning activity, or you have those staff working on something else that benefit the students, those grants will continue to be paid. The thinking behind this has been pretty much that since none of us could have anticipated this, and all of you had budgets in place for the year that expected a certain level of revenue, our goal is continuity of operations. None of the grants I've been receiving some questions about whether or not the entitlement grants will be prorated to reflect the shortened school year. And that is not going to happen. Again, you anticipated a certain amount of revenue from the state at the time you did your budget, and we plan on sustaining that. The one thing I would caution about is that your excess cost student-based special education grant is going to be paid based upon your March 1 filing. It is possible, depending upon what your actual expenditures end up being, that you would see an adjustment to your grant amount in the following year when we do the reconciliation. Any adjustment would show up in your April 2021 ECS. But what I would say to you is, as we get closer to that time, and if we notice that there's any significant discrepancy for any district, we will certainly talk with you and see if there's something we can do in light of the current situation. But I just wanted you to be cognizant of that. Another area that I'm getting a lot of questions on is the potential to extend the timeline for expenditures of state grant funds beyond the close of the fiscal year. Currently in statute, we have authority to carry forward unspent Alliance District funding. That is the only program that we have legislative authority currently to do that for. So what I would be really helpful would be, to the extent that there are grants that you are concerned about expending all the funds, I encourage you to email me. I have a punch list of items that I am sharing with the Office of Policy and Management around which grants we think that districts will still need the funding to be available to them in the following year. And hopefully I can get some guidance from OPM on which ones they'll be supportive of, and we will be able to provide you with some flexibility, because that would be our goal. Another thing that I'm getting questions about from the districts is how to do your end of the school year expenditure filings in light of what's going on. We are developing guidance in my office. At the moment, we're not prepared to issue that guidance. I was waiting for the Federal CARES Act information so that what we send you will be complete, but that will be coming. Just to move quickly into okay, Michelle, I'm having trouble moving the screen to the next one. Oh, thank you. So the department has created a team of the federal program managers, and it's going to be led by my office to provide guidance, distribute the funds that come through the Fed from the Federal CARES Act, and do the reporting of those funds. So this team is, we actually have our first meeting tomorrow, and I have all of the program managers assembling the current guidance around how their Title I funding, IDEA funding, Perkins, McKinney-Vento, Title IIA can currently be spent, and we are taking a look at that as compared to some of the guidance that we are now getting from the federal government on the implementation of the CARES Act. There's over $13 billion that will be SEA administered, and 90% of the funds that the state receives, and our number is just around it. Between the two pots, it's a little over 120 million. About 90% of those funds, if not more, will be being distributed to LEAs. The department can actually retain a small percentage for administration, and we have not yet made a decision about whether or not we will do that. Let's see. One of the other things, Michelle, if you could move me, thank you. The second pot of funding is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is going to be administered by the Governor's Office. I have asked to find out who the point person at the Governor's Office is going to be on this. This money can be used for a combination of emergency support to both our LEAs that have been significantly impacted by the coronavirus. We will need to work on a definition of what does significantly impacted mean. We will be doing that over the next week. The balance of the funds is to provide emergency support to institutes of higher education or other educational related entities within the state that the governor deems essential for carrying out educational services. And Michelle, can we switch again? All right. So over the weekend, the department received some guidance along with a template for us to file for waivers and for various provisions under Title I and Title IV and Title IIA. Essentially, the department is going to be submitting the waiver. It's my goal to have it sent to the feds by Thursday. We were just doing a review of the programs. Again, in order to enable us to provide you with as much flexibility as possible, I think one of the key things about the guidance is that, you know, it allows you to exceed the 15% carryover limitation from ESSA. And it also provides some significant flexibility in the new Title IV Part A in terms of how you can spend those funds. Michelle, would you mind? Yes. So these two slides essentially just say which sections of the, no, that's okay. I'm fine with you moving forward, Michelle. Of the federal CARES Act, the department can seek waivers under. And as soon as we have received guidance from the federal government that our waiver has been accepted, which I anticipate will happen, we will be sharing that as part of our guidance to you. And the last slide is I've gotten multiple questions about how do executive orders 7C and 7I potentially impact the control that boards of education have over developing their budget or then actually expending their budget. So I reached out to OPM and the governor's office to get some clarifying language, and the language you see on the screen is actually language that was developed by them in order to make it clear that neither executive order alters or modifies the control of line items that fall squarely within boards of education authority. And boards of education should still be planning on meeting their normal requirements pertaining to budget development, budget deadlines. So the flexibility afforded municipalities was not designed to take away the Board of Education's independence in developing its budget and then spending its budget. And I thought that was something important to share because I received a number of calls from people who are concerned about that. I'm now going to open it up for questions, and I will do my best to answer your questions. And again, if not, if there's something I can't answer, it is going to become part of our FAQs that we will then be sending those answers back out to you. And thank you so much for participating today.
Great, Kathy, thank you. That was a lot of really useful information. And I just want to remind the people that are on this call, please ask your questions using the Q&A box. I know a few of you have your hands raised. We're not going to be unmuting any participants, so you really need to type those questions into the Q&A box so we can address them. So we do have a few questions, Kathy, and I'll go through them with you right now. The first is, when could we expect guidance/direction on handling of federal/state grants, for instance, rollover, use of funds, etc.?
So that is an excellent question. I actually think we may well have the federal guidance a little bit before the state guidance, only because we're in the midst of applying for the waivers, and then we have a very short window of time in order to get the funding out to local school districts in order to start helping you out. In terms of the state grants, because this has been the legislative process, which was underway, has been short-circuited. We have a budget in place for fiscal 21. What we don't have is legislative authority for doing things like carry forwards of state grant funds into the following year. Again, the only current statute that we have that provides that kind of relief is for the Alliance District funding. So I have a list of grants into OPM for guidance on. My thoughts about that is that they will be coordinating with the General Assembly's leadership and the governor's office about how to respond to school districts. I would say keep in mind that statutorily you do have the ability to retain up to 2% of your unspent funding into next year. I realize given the nature of some of the costs that you're anticipating, that may not be sufficient. But please know that that is something the department is working on, and we will get you an answer on both the federal and the state grant pieces as soon as possible.
Great. The next question is regarding excess costs. We are now working with our legal counsel on special education, transportation, which we are being asked to work with transportation companies. How will these excess costs be formulated? We do not know yet how much we will have to pay.
So, actually, I think a two-part question. First of all, excess cost will be based on your March 1 filing. So we already have the data that you've submitted to us as of March 1 in order to make the payments for the current year. Where a potential impact might come would be to the extent that those expenditures didn't continue at the same pace as you originally submitted for, that you may be facing an adjustment in your April 2021 ECS. However, in light of the circumstances, that is something that we will be working with districts on once we understand the magnitude of it. And because like you, we just don't have a sense yet of how much that will impact school districts. The piece about working with your transportation providers, the executive order that was done encouraged school districts to the extent possible for both special education transportation and regular education transportation to negotiate agreements with their transportation providers to continue providing funding to them so that they could continue to employ their staff and that some of their fixed costs would be absorbed, with the idea that when school was ready to start back up, there would be no lag in start because districts were scrambling with their transportation vendors to try and find bus drivers, which, as we all know, there is a shortage of. Actually, I regularly see the billboards when I drive to work advertising for people to become bus drivers. So the idea was to keep that kind of the school district ecosystem, we've been calling it, in place. And one of the things that is an important part of your ecosystem is your transportation contracts.
Okay. The next question is, and you might have just addressed this one, Kathy, but I'm going to read it again. Sure. Will CSDE provide specific direction on payment to transportation companies, percentage, direct costs only, etc.?
So, I mean, this does follow up to the question that I just addressed. We will not be providing specific guidance We wanted districts to have the flexibility, given that there are 167 of you and then the rest and the charter schools, to be able to negotiate directly with your transportation vendor. And the reason we did that is that the transportation vendors were seeking that districts should have to pay them for all 180 days. Districts were concerned about what that meant in terms of would they be paying for costs that like fuel costs that are, have nothing to do with people remaining employed or with the maintenance of the fleet. So we will not be issuing specific guidance on that. There is a follow-up FAQ that went out yesterday. I believe it went out yesterday afternoon, but I will confirm that. That does provide some additional guidance to school districts on just what it was that the intent of that executive order is. But our thinking in doing that was to allow districts the flexibility, because you are all individual, you all have your own contracts with transportation vendors, to negotiate something that best met the district's needs.
Thanks. I just want to remind everyone on the call that these slides will be available on our website under the CSDE COVID-19 page district support series, as well as a recording of this, including a transcript of the call. Okay, so we have another question. Have you heard what the percentage of excess cost reimbursement will be for this year?
I know it is somewhere between 70 and 75%, but I actually have not. I will check that out with the person who in my office who's responsible for the calculations, and I can send out an email to everyone just letting them know what the actual percentage will be.
Thanks. This one is related to that. Clarification on excess cost grant. Will the final calculation be based upon the March filing or the June filing? I understand that the adjustment will appear in April 2021.
So the adjustment itself, the payment that you are currently going to receive is based on your March 1 filing. The adjustment is based upon your audited actual end of the year expenditures, which we don't get from you until December 31st, which is why the adjustment comes in the following April. We do have a preliminary view of it when you do your initial filing in September of your end of the year expenditures, but we wait for the audited data in order to actually do the calculation.
Along those same lines, can you explain more when you say you will support districts if we see a drop?
So one of the things, and I think none of us, has the crystal ball at the moment to know just what your final expenditures are going to look like. And to the extent that on March 1 you filed estimating, that your excess cost needs were somewhere in the range of $2 million. And it turns out that at the end of the fiscal year, by the time all of the auditing is done and stuff, the reality was the expenditures were $1.6 million. And you received your reimbursement based upon the $2 million figure. So to the extent that that differential might potentially cause a negative adjustment next year to your April ECS, what we will try and understand better is how significant that looks. And based upon that, if we see districts are being truly harmed by that, then that is something that we would bring up with OPM and the legislature to see if there was potentially some relief that could be provided to districts because of the unusual circumstances of this year.
Okay, Okay, I have a question about fiscal year 21. Is the state fiscal year 21 standing as passed, or are we looking at state reductions for fiscal year 21? Municipalities are making decisions now on district budgets without insight on fiscal year 21 state funds.
So as of right now, the fiscal 21 state grant funds have been enacted in the budget bill from last year. We have received no indication that there will be an adjustment to those. As I said, the legislature and the governor's office and OPM are working on potential language that might be needed in order to offer relief for what's going on right now for COVID for both municipalities and school districts. But at this time, I would say you should anticipate the revenue projections to remain about the same based upon the budget that was passed already for fiscal 21.
Okay, this question is about food service. Will there be any assistance available to help offset food service costs? We are delivering meals to children in district, but are not charging families.
So that is a great question. Somebody else had asked me that the other day. And I have been in conversation with our bureau chief from nutrition, and we are seeking some additional guidance from the USDA on our ability to reimburse for the meals that you're providing, if there will be any flexibility with federal funding, or is that something that we then will need to address at the state level, potentially with state subsidy? So we are working on that. I don't have an answer yet, but we realize that that is a need that districts are seeing.
Thanks. Let's see, we've got one about Title I grant or title grants. Our title grant has an allocation to a private school in our district. Will we still have to allocate some of the funds to that school, or can our funds stay in our district?
As of right now, the guidance we're receiving, even for the new federal CARES Act funds, does have the equity provision where you will continue to provide funding or services to the private schools within your district's boundaries.
How are you doing, Kathy? I still have a lot more questions. Doing okay?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
All right, here we go. Will the emergency relief funds need to be spent this fiscal year?
Good question, and no. So this fiscal year obviously ends June 30th. My understanding from the guidance that I've seen to date is that those funds will, expenditure of them will be allowed through 2021. But that will come out again. We will be sending out some guidance as soon as we have a little more information from the feds on that. But I do not anticipate that you need to spend those funds by the close of this fiscal year.
Okay, great. This one is, we're back on the bus companies because this is a little bit of a different scenario than what had been asked. Okay, so this one, we've been directed to pay, at least in part, our bus companies to keep their drivers as paid employees. But our bus company has already laid off drivers. Will they be required to hire them back? How does this affect what amount we are required to pay?
Another good question. So, I mean, the bus company is not required to hire them back. And obviously, if they do not hire those employees back, you are not required to pay them. The which is a big part of the reason why we left the flexibility language in to allow districts to negotiate with their individual bus contract providers. So, if for some reason those bus companies did not re-engage their employees and had no intention of it, even if you were to pay them, then no, the department is not suggesting that you have to continue to pay that contractor.
Thanks. Okay. If waiver received, does this mean districts can use Title 2A and 4 to address expenses related to implementing distance learning, as well as related expenses that were not the intended use of funds per application?
Good question. So based on the initial guidance that we're seeing, particularly with Title 4A, it looks like the districts will be given greater flexibility to use those funds to address things like distance learning and the fact that you needed to ramp up so quickly. We will provide, again, specific guidance on what those flexibilities are as soon as we have them. But yes, that's my initial reading is that there's going to be flexibility available to school districts to accommodate the expenditures that arose because of COVID that just were completely unanticipated.
Can you offer any guidance regarding ER7R, paying transportation contractors? The order states wages and health insurance for transportation company employees. Our contractor is also demanding other quote unquote fixed costs. Any guidance?
The intention of the executive is to continue to make sure that this important system to school districts is still available at the time that school began. As part of your negotiation at the local level, one of the things you may be willing to consider with your bus vendor is an apportionment of some fixed costs. The executive order does not forbid you from doing that. It does not order you to do that. I would say that, again, it's going to be case dependent. If your contract is with a small vendor, you may well be looking at, to the extent that you are unable to come to terms with the vendor, that they just may not be in existence come September or whenever it is that we end up reopening school, if it's a month from now. And that could create significant issues for the district in, bringing children back to school as quickly as possible. So our hope is that through local negotiation with the vendor, districts and the transportation vendors will come to an agreement that recognizes that there are still ongoing costs that in order to stay afloat that many of the vendors have, and that you can find for lack of a better way of saying it, a happy medium, an acceptable amount that the district is comfortable paying the bus vendor for.
Okay, this one it's similar, but they want to know in terms of their transportation contracts, is the executive order to pay transportation contracts interpreted that the bus company should be providing districts with a roster of employees detailing pay, benefits, etc., or is submitting an overall outline of their expenses sufficient?
Well, I will say this. I would ask personally before I paid for anything on the department's half for a roster of people that they were paying and how much they were being paid and what their insurance costs were. I don't think that that's an unreasonable thing to ask, and I think it will allow you to be able to reassure your boards of ed, your municipalities that the expenditures were in line with what you were anticipating. So I would recommend that as just a good practice.
Okay, this is about Title IV. Will Title IV technology funds that are limited to 15% be increased to a higher threshold to support the purchase of Chromebooks, etc., for distance learning?
So the early guidance that I've seen, it does look like that it lifts the limitation of how much you can spend on technology in Title IV. And again, we will share that information as soon as you have it, but that is what I was seeing through some of the initial guidance that we've received, was offering districts flexibility in that area.
Thank you. Kathy, I've gotten a few people asking where they can find the FAQ that you made mention of. Would that be on the COVID page?
It is. It's on the governor's COVID page.
On the governor's COVID page, not on the CSDE.
Yes, but I'm happy to put a link on our COVID page to it. I think I can probably figure that out with Andrea.
Okay. And also people are asking me about the slides, and those will be posted on our COVID-19 website under the district support page. So if you go to our home page, there's a link to that page.
Yes.
Okay. So when do you anticipate that the Education Stabilization Grant funds under the CARES Act will be distributed to LEAs?
I do not have a date yet or their distribution. The state actually has to send in an application for those funds. I have yet to receive a template for that application, but it's my understanding that they are moving as fast as they can at USED. And as soon as we have something, then we will be submitting whatever is necessary to USED to get those funds. And, you know, my hope would be within the next couple of weeks, we'll actually be able to be providing funds to school districts.
Thanks. For the emergency funds, will districts have to apply for these?
Right now, my understanding is that it will be a formulaic grant, similar to the, how title funds are distributed. What will be really important, and again, we will provide guidance around this, is a monitoring of how and a tracking of how you've expended those funds. The USDOE has indicated that they will expect an accounting for those funds similar to ARA, and which was really in depth. But I'm sorry, Michelle, now I've lost the track of the question.
It was about whether they're going to have to apply to get the emergency funds, but it sounds like you don't think so, or?
No, I think we will be distributing it as an entitlement grant.
Okay. All right. When can districts expect to know how much, if any, of the federal funds they will receive, and are those expected to be expended in fiscal year 20, fiscal year 21, or both?
As I said earlier, as soon as we have enough information to provide formal guidance, we will be doing that. I anticipate it happening very rapidly. In terms of expenditure, based on what I'm seeing right now, it looks like the expenditures will continue through 2020, 2021. But again, we will provide formal guidance to you on that.
Okay. Is there any guidance on paying / rehiring food service staff? Our staff was paid from revenues. Their labor costs were not budgeted in our general fund.
So this is one of the reasons that we've reached out to the USDA to see if there would be any relief offered to school districts in order to keep those staff employed, and if not, then what consideration at the state level could we potentially do to assist districts with that? So I would say stay tuned. We're still trying to get some more answers on that.
Okay, we only have a couple more, so you're almost done. Given the likely impact on revenue at the state level, is there an expected impact on seat allocation for charter schools?
So this charter school budget it was approved as part of the Budget Act last year for fiscal 21. The guidance that we have given so far about enrollment for fiscal 21, and this was prior to the COVID thing occurring, is that you would continue with your existing enrollment unless you had a situation where you were one of the newer schools that was still enrolling additional grades. That is the guidance that we continue to provide, and I have yet to hear anything suggesting otherwise.
Okay. If the transportation company can tell us the amount they would have been spent on individual special education students, can these costs be reported for excess cost reimbursement?
Transportation company, I mean, I think there would need to be a second part to that. So if you're anticipating on paying the transportation company for what would have been those expected costs as part of what you negotiate with them, then they would be considered. If you were not going to be paying the transportation company for those what were expected costs, then no, they would not be eligible.
Okay, has there been any discussion on effective delays of recently passed unfunded mandates prior to COVID-19 as additional relief?
You know what, it would be really helpful if you forwarded to me which mandates you were talking about, and I will have our legislative liaison, Laura Stefan, look into that further.
Great. That was actually the last one, besides someone saying what an amazing job you did, and I agree. So I want to thank everyone that's on the webinar. Thank you for attending, and Kathy will be able to get a list of all the questions that were addressed, and she will be able to provide a question and answer sheet regarding those. And we can do, as I said, the slides will be posted as well as the recorded version of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, and be well.
Yes.